About 525 of them were built throughout the war. They could do about 15 knots. They could carry all forms of petroleum. They were very instrumental in being able to support our forces overseas with large amounts of petroleum products.
By the end of the war, the Navy's oilers and tankers have provided an invaluable lifeline of fuel to the Allied forces. While the oil tanker of World War II had achieved new levels of performance and size, a booming post-war economy was about to give rise to the oil tanker tycoon and the dawn of the supertanker. During the invasion of Okinawa in World War II, oilers delivered over 10 million barrels of fuel oil to the fleet at sea by underway replenishment. Oil tankers will return on Modern Marvels. The end of World War II marked the beginning of unprecedented growth for the United States economy. Post-war Americans wanted to drive fast and travel far. By the early 1950s, American imports of petroleum products exceeded exports for the first time. Oil companies and ambitious entrepreneurs were eager to feed America's high demand for oil and took advantage of a unique opportunity.
After the Second World War, the U.S. government has over 600 tankers of all sorts. The American oil companies put pressure upon the U.S. government to sell off these surplus T2 tankers. So for about 4 years, the United States sells over 400 of these 600 tankers to American and foreign oil companies.
Many of the T2 tankers were retrofitted by their new owners so that they could carry more cargo. Using a process called jumboizing, the ships were cut in half, and an extra section was added to the middle, thus doubling the tanker's storage capacity. The 1950s also saw a trio of independent shipping tycoons begin to stake their claim in the burgeoning oil trade. Greek shipping magnates Aristotle Onassis and Stavros Niarchos joined American Daniel Ludwig in an unofficial competition over who could lay claim to the title of owner of the world's largest tanker.
The competition that existed between the various independent owners was just probably as much ego as it was economics of the day. There was a lot of status carrying I now have the world's largest tanker.
American ship owner Daniel Ludwig chose to go overseas to the Kure shipyards in Japan to build his tanker fleet.
That was a surprise to the industry worldwide, because historically the ships were either built in Europe or they were built in the United States. And all of a sudden Japan came in as a third competitor.
In Japan, Ludwig found a country desperate for industry and a highly skilled workforce with a proud tradition in shipbuilding. As Ludwig began to build his tanker fleet, Greek shipowner Aristotle Onassis grabbed the title of world's largest tanker owner with the launching of the Tina Onassis in 1952. His Greek rival, Stavros Niarchos, bested him in 1955 with the 47,000 deadweight ton vessel, Spiros Niarchos. But it was political instability in the Middle East that would bring tanker tonnage to unprecedented levels. The Suez Canal, which links the Mediterranean Sea with the Red Sea, provides the shortest shipping route from the oil-rich Middle East to ports in Europe and the United States. In 1956, Egypt nationalized the previously unrestricted passageway. Israel, which relied heavily on the canal for trade, considered this a threat. Joined by Britain and France, Israel declared war on Egypt. The conflict left ships scuttled along the vital waterway, and the canal was closed. Ultimately, the United Nations settled the conflict, and the canal was reopened. But the tanker industry felt it could no longer rely on the political instability of the passageway.
There was a realization that the oil that was moving from the Middle East to Europe, to the United States, had to come around South Africa, around the Cape.
The route around the Cape of Good Hope and then north to Europe or the U.S. added as much as 11,000 miles round trip to a tanker's voyage. To maintain the normal flow of crude to both continents, tanker tonnage had to increase by nearly 100%. The industry was left with two alternatives: either build a large fleet of small vessels or a small fleet of large vessels. The decision came down to the economics of scale.
If you had a box 10 foot by 10 foot by 10 foot, there's let's call it feet. There's 1,000 feet within that box. If you go 20, 20, and 20, it is 8 times the volume. So it's not linear. By just doubling the size, you create huge amount of volume.
And there was a rush to build a lot of large tankers, super tankers at that time. A large part of the industry said this is the future.
After the closure of the Suez Canal, Daniel Ludwig set the maritime world abuzz by breaking the 100,000 deadweight ton barrier with the launching of the Universe Apollo. The supertanker was born. Around this same time, a dramatic change began to take place in tanker design. The three-tower arrangement that originated with the Glukov was combined into one superstructure, placed at the stern, leaving the entire forward hull for tank space. As maritime engineers began to transform the tanker's design, deadweight tonnage barriers continued to fall. In 1966, the Idemitsu Maru became the first tanker to eclipse 200,000 deadweight tons, becoming the first VLCC, or Very Large Crude Carrier. Just 1 year later, the Suez Canal closed again, this time for 8 years. The industry's gamble in building supertankers had paid off. And Daniel Ludwig was ready to push the envelope of size even farther. In 1967, he unveiled the 300,000 deadweight ton Universe Ireland. Ludwig had once again established a new record in tanker tonnage. The Universe Ireland became the first ULCC, or ultra-large crude carrier. Ludwig's landmark achievements, breaking the 100,000 and 300,000 tonnage barriers, gave him the recognition among his peers as the father of the supertanker. But for the United States, the world's largest importer of oil, the draft of a fully loaded supertanker posed a large problem.
None of the ports could handle a ship of that draft. So what we find happening still today in the United States is these larger crude carriers come in, they stay offshore 20, 30 miles, and they actually do what we call lightering, which is take the oil from the large ship and actually put it on a smaller ship, which does have the draft to allow it to go into these ports.
Lightering typically takes place while both ships are underway. Maneuvering the smaller ship alongside the larger tanker can be dangerous.
This is a lightering fender. What we use them for is to keep the two ships that are lightering from coming in contact with each other. As you can imagine, the size of these is tremendous because there's tremendous forces involved in bringing two full-size tankers together that are carrying perhaps 300,000 tons of cargo each. We don't want them coming into contact at sea.
With the fenders in place, the ships are moored alongside each other. After checking to make sure the tankers are secure, rubber hoses measuring up to 90 feet in length are transferred over to the lightering vessel. Typically, cargo is offloaded using a 250 psi pump, which can transfer oil at a rate of 30,000 barrels an hour. By the 1970s, the growth of the tanker industry appeared limitless. But this burst of growth would soon be stunted by a series of supertanker explosions and several devastating oil spills. A fully loaded supertanker traveling at a speed of 16 knots needs up to 20 minutes to stop. Oil tankers will return on Modern Marvels.